Here we've got a really, really simple composition. Maybe it's big rocks on a beach with a kind of a blown out sky. Whatever it is, it has 3 simple values. And I'm actually going to make 2 copies here so we can look at it. Now, what if we took these as a base, but then within each of those areas of value, we added slightly lighter values and slightly darker values? Well, we would get something that looks a little bit like this. Now, at a glance, the one on the right is starting to look much more like a real painting. Sure, the shapes are all basic, but within each shape, we have a much more lively blend of sort of implied details and lights and darks. We can imagine some stuff going on here. There's some life. However, we've retained this graphic read from the 3-value study. Here's the big takeaway. This is what I really want to teach with this progression of assignments, is that there is power in the 3-value study. That we've taken a complicated photo reference and we've forced it into clarity. But in doing so, we've also lost a lot of the detail. So now we're going to start bringing that detail back, but we're going to do so in a structured way. The goal here is to take some of the finished results from the last 3-value study, and we're going to use a little bit of Photoshop trickery to continue the painting process. So what I want to do is I want to guarantee that I'm painting inside of 3 areas: the light area, the medium area, and the dark area. So I'm actually going to flatten everything. We don't need any of those layers from the previous assignment. Instead, all I need to do is to make essentially 3 groups. I'm going to have a light, medium, and dark. And then I need to mask each of those groups to make sure I stay in the lines. So let's put dark at the bottom of the pile, and the way I'm going to make the mask is actually really easy. You could do it in a couple different ways. I'm going to use the select color range. And then I'm just going to pick on dark, adjust the fuzziness a little bit to make sure I get the right edges there. Okay, cool. So now I have all the dark areas selected. I go to the group that I could even call dark if I want to, and then apply that as a mask. Do the same with the middle value. So this is all the medium areas. Cool. And the same then with the light areas. Great. The nice thing now is I can just make as many layers as I want within each of these groups, and I can not worry about the lines at all. Really, the only hard part is just remembering which group I want to paint in. So just like in that example, now I'm going to take the foundation that I so carefully made in the last one, and I'm going to start dividing. So let's start in some of the areas that were actually the hardest to determine. And I think right over here was the hardest in that last assignment because it could have gone a little lighter or it could have gone a little darker, and I ended up kind of generalizing it to call it dark. So within my dark folder, I'll make a new layer. And what I'm going to do here is something that you may have not seen me do in other videos. I'm actually going to lengthen the physical size of the color palette. Now, why would I do that? Well, when it is small like this, a small change in the mouse position is going to yield a large change in value. You know, the distance from very dark to all the way light is maybe only an inch or 2 on my tablet. And that was fine when I only wanted to have these dramatically different values. Well, now we're working in the subtle. Okay, so if I'm working on subtle changes and I make this box much bigger, now I can much more easily get kind of a slightly darker, a slightly lighter. So how big you make it on screen is up to you, but I'm going to have it a little bit bigger. And I'm going to start by sampling the starting point, which is here. And I'm going to start moving it up and down a little bit. Key here is subtlety. So I'm going to turn my lines back on so I can make sure I'm painting in the right place. But here's where I'm going to start making shapes more prominent. And the tools I have at my disposal are still value, but I want to make sure that the range is kept in check. So now let's, as an example, do a slightly lighter version. Maybe I want to make sure that I can get this stripe to pop back out here. So I could either make it darker like this, but maybe what I want to do is to lighten up the surrounding value. So I'm going to Alt click to get the starting point, and then I'm going to lighten it a slight bit here. and I'm going to paint outside of the stripe. And by doing so, I'm now making the stripe visible. See how that worked? So the stripe is actually unchanged, but I have lightened up the surrounding value, and voila, I can have two shapes separate from each other. And as I look at this reference, I have to kind of keep going down that hierarchy. I have to look at what is kind of the next biggest shape that I can, separate within this large area of value. And there are these nice architectural panels. I think they're screens of some sort. I imagine they let in a little bit of fresh air. Not quite sure, but they are essentially darker rectangles inset within these larger walls. And so the way I'm achieving that is by lightening up the area around them, just like I did with a stripe. So let's take a quick look at this. If I were to hide this, this is the end of last assignment. This is 3 values. And now I'm going to show you the progress I've made so far. You can see so many more shapes in here. It's starting to look much more like a painting. But when we look at it from far away, it doesn't compete. See, I'm toggling on and off here. It's really not trying to steal the show from the large scale value breakdown. What I could call the initial read is really just this 3 value poster composition. It gives us the gist of it, kind of the essence. Well, the trick here is to begin adding in the second read that, when you glance at it first, you kind of get the big idea. And then if you were to sit and look at the image longer, well, then you would get this second level of information. The danger is that as you're adding in these details, you accidentally say, oh, okay, I know this area is lighter, so I'm going to make it lighter. Oh, and I know this area is darker, so I'm going to make it a lot darker because I'm looking at my reference really close, and my brain is going to play tricks on me. Your brain is set up to look for contrast. What we have to do here is to give ourselves rules to force this contrast to live within a narrow range. Now, the order in which I divide these shapes up into smaller and smaller shapes is totally personal preference. I'm actually going to leave this darker area as it is right now. We'll probably return to it in a minute, but what I want to do is to pick big areas. So I'm going to start actually with the sky. So I go into my light group, I make a new layer, and now anything I paint within this area is going to be inside the lines. Cool. So let's see here. I think the first important thing is to separate the building from the sky. So in my line work here, you can see there's this building in the backdrop that's completely left out. So I think what I'm going to do is to select its border and invert that selection. And all this is going to do is allow me to paint everything but that building. And then I'm going to sample this starting value and darken it a bit. Because what I want to do is I want this building to pop out, and one way to do it, as you just saw with the stripe example, is to paint everything else. So here I'm painting kind of a slow transition to make the sky transition into this darker bit here. And then when I hide the lines, you can see that I have a very clear shape of a building here, even though I'm really only painting the sky around it. So you can either paint the background or the shape itself. The end result is the same. We get this border with contrast. And now, still working inside this border, I see that there's actually a slightly darker still blue here. There's this kind of blue sky with a cloud edge. And so what I might want to do is to lighten up this value here, and it's going to get a little bit closer to the building, so I kind of lose that contrast on the building, but then it makes the contrast on the edge of the cloud shadow a little bit more visible. So really, it's kind of up to you. You're playing this balancing game where you're looking at various shapes that border each other, and you're trying to make certain edges really prominent, and you're trying to make certain edges fade away. The danger, once again, I'm going to keep saying this, is that you can't allow the overall value range to get out of control. So let's hide this layer here. And I look at that and I think, that actually might be too much contrast. So, I'm going to use an adjustment layer. There are other ways of doing this, but I just want to lower the contrast of the strokes I've already put down just a little bit. Okay, that's better. So here you can see there's still quite a visible distinction between the edge of the building and where the various cloud shapes are. But at a distance, I am still retaining that very clear separation between the three primary values. And that's really the balancing act we're doing here. Subdividing without merging that original nice clean three values into kind of a mud. Okay, now jumping around, I'm going to pick, I want to do this plaza area. So that's in the medium value. So I'll make a new layer in the medium value folder. And I could first say that because of the vignetting in the camera lens, the edges are just a little bit darker. So the corners here, I'm going to darken them a bit. Definitely darker over on the left side. I could go a little darker still. Another big shape I notice are these reflections from the columns. So I'm going to pick this dark value here and just pull straight down from each of these columns. It kind of starts sharp and then it fades out, gets a little more diffused as we go further down. And you can use maybe a soft eraser if you want to kind of erase after you've put down your color, just to kind of ease those transitions a little bit. Now when I look at this, I have to ask myself, is it too high contrast? If I hide it, make it visible again, is the impression of this being a middle value being lost? And I think it is a little bit, so I'm just going to lower the opacity a tiny bit. So we can still see this nice separation between the reflection from the column and this area next to it. But the contrast between these two new values is still way less than the contrast between dark and medium. So let's keep it that way. What other cool areas can I work on? Yeah, I think there are these extra kind of inlays in the arch that are really missing out here. So I'm going to pick a medium value to kind of call attention to these. It's not quite like outlining. It's almost just a little cast shadow, or like an ambient occlusion shadow. That, it can be hard, certainly if your lines are visible, it can be hard to tell if your contrast is too much or not enough. So here with the lines off, I'm getting a better representation of that border between the two values. And I could probably go a little bit darker. No, I liked it before. This subtlety might feel forced. Certainly at first you're just going to want to use a full value range, but believe me, forcing yourself to work in this way is an extremely valuable experience, because you're not always going to paint this way. What I'm doing is giving you some kind of artificial rules. But what they do is they force you to sit back and to kind of ask yourself questions. You're trying to solve a puzzle as much as make a painting. And what that does is it forces you to really kind of juggle the reference that you're looking at, what values are bordering what other values, and you're kind of forcing them into your own sort of structure. You're not just blindly following what the reference gives you and not making any changes. Because what this means is once you start to go make your own compositions, you're not going to have reference to look at in terms of the general kind of value structure of the image. And you can think back to this experience, the way that you are forcing that initial read to stay clear even as you start to add values here. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself a bit. One thing I want to add here is implied detail. So if you look at the reference, there is this really detailed kind of knotting trim work around the edge. It's this nice geometric repeat pattern. Well, I'm not going to draw all those little lines. I think that's going to be too fussy. This is just a study. But what I can do is say, generally speaking, a slightly darker value, almost like a little stripe, could kind of give the implication. So just like a little darker. That's too subtle. So I'm just using the click, shift click method to pull a straight line. Making sure to keep a light stripe at the top as well. And then since there are these knots that kind of come down in between the arches, I'm just going to indicate those with a brush stroke. So what I've done there is I have done a very rough approximation, a gross simplification, but at this scale and with this size of brush stroke, it kind of gives you enough information. Another thing I think I want to do is to give some indication of the directionality of these tiles. Because in the floor, there's these really cool tiles that kind of enhance the perspective. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use low contrast stripes just to kind of give that sense of tiling without actually drawing each individual tile. And we'll see how the contrast looks here. I might need to kind of lighten it up a bit, but I think it'll kind of give you the right impression. Yeah, that's a nice kind of a subtle impression of a bunch of bricks. Now another area that is really being lost in shadow here is in the dark underneath the arches. So I'm going to start with the dark value I already have, and I'm going to lighten it up a bit because I notice there's some nice light being reflected off of the floor and bouncing back up underneath these arches. So you get this kind of reflected light underlighting, which is almost always present underneath bridges. If you take a look, they'll have kind of a lighter center that's even lighter than the legs themselves. And you can return to areas you've already done, and as you start to add detail around the image, you can always add more. I am probably not going to add a whole lot more detail to this image because I think really the beauty of this exercise is not in making one absolutely detailed image. I would rather see you do a bunch of these. So I might call this nearly finished. I can do a little bit more fussing around here, but really getting new reference, starting over, and making these creative choices again is really the important part. And with that, I'm ready to call this one done. What am I left with? So let's take all of the light, medium, dark layers that I've made for this painting, select them all, add them into a group, and now I can hide this to kind of do a before and after. So here is the before, and here is the after. Especially when we look at these from a distance, you can see that the before and the after still have the general same look. They have kind of the same gesture or the same impression. However, I think when you look at this, you really get the sense of the building materials, and it starts to feel a bit more like a painting. There's just more information. This is more like a panel out of a comic book or a poster. It is really abstract. Now you could continue in this as long as you wanted, but this, I think, for our purposes is enough detail. So I encourage you to make, 10 of these, 20 of these. These are tough, but they're worth the work.